Red Hollow lay under a sky the color of old gunmetal, its single dirt street carved through the valley like a scar that refused to heal. The wind rolled down from the mesas, dry and restless, carrying with it the sound of a saloon door creaking, a horse snorting, a drunk's cough fading into the dust. Folks here didn't talk much. They'd seen what talk brought: trouble, envy, death. It was a place where the law was a rumor and justice, when it came, wore a face no one expected. And at the center of it all stood the Hensley Saloon, light leaking through its windows like gold through cracks in a coffin. Behind the bar, Clara Hensley polished the same glass she'd been cleaning for 10 minutes. Her hands moved, but her mind drifted somewhere else, maybe to the wide Kansas field she'd left behind, or to her late husband, whose laugh still echoed when the nights grew long and lonely. The men who filled the saloon didn't know that kind of softness anymore. They came here for whiskey, cards, and forgetfulness, not for kindness. Yet somehow Clara offered it all the same. When she smiled, it wasn't the tired grin of a saloon girl. It was something pure, like a small light daring to shine in a land that had forgotten morning. A handful of ranch hands played poker by the stove, their laughter forced, their eyes darting to the door each time the wind pushed against it. In one corner, a preacher-turned-drifter muttered scripture between drinks. Near the back, an old miner tuned a cracked guitar, the notes as brittle as his fingers. Red Hollow lived off the slow, choking rhythm of waiting, for payday, for rain, for something terrible to end or finally begin. Clara could feel it too, like thunder far away. Every night carried the same stillness before a storm no one wanted to see. The saloon air was thick with smoke and sweat. Lanterns threw soft gold across warp tables, painting faces and half-truths and shadows. Boots thudded, spurs clinked, laughter cracked and died quickly. Even the piano player, a scrawny man with tobacco-stained teeth, seemed afraid to let the melody breathe too loud. The mirror behind the bar caught everything: the nerves, the lies, the ghosts in each man's reflection. And always, in the center of it, Clara, trying to hold together something that was already falling apart. She served the cowboys with careful hands. To one, she offered a kind word about his son in Fort Worth. To another, she reminded him to get home before his wife locked him out again. She wasn't just serving whiskey. She was handing out mercy in small, amber glasses. They all knew it, though none would say it out loud. In a town that had run out of saints, Clara Hensley had become the last one standing behind a counter. Then, as the wind gave a sudden cry down the street, the saloon door swung open. The light outside died the instant he stepped in. He was tall, dust-coated, his hat pulled low, his duster brushing against his boots like a shadow alive. Conversations fell off mid-word. Cards paused mid-fall. Even the piano choked into silence. A moonlight that didn't have to announce his name. His presence did it for him. Silas Kane. Some whispered it under their breath, as though speaking it too loud would summon something worse. Others didn't need to. They'd heard stories, towns burned to ash, gangs left buried in shallow graves, a sheriff once found nailed to his own badge. Nobody ever proved what was true. In the frontier, truth was a luxury, and legends were easier to live with. But one thing everyone agreed on: Silas Kane was not a man you crossed, unless you wanted your name forgotten before sunrise. He walked toward the bar, boots whispering against the dust. His face was carved hard, the kind that had forgotten softness. A scar ran down from his right temple, fading into a beard the color of smoke. His eyes, cold, gray, and precise, didn't search the room so much as measure it. He moved like a man used to carrying a gun not as a weapon, but as an extension of judgment. And yet, when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, almost gentle. "Whiskey," he said. "Neat." Clara poured without a word, her hand steady though her heart wasn't. When she slid the glass toward him, his gloved fingers brushed hers. For an instant, she caught something strange in his eyes. Tiredness, maybe, or the faintest ghost of sorrow. He nodded once, a gesture of respect not often found in men like him. "Much obliged, ma'am." The silence in the saloon stretched. Men looked away, pretending to care about their cards again, their drinks, the dust on their boots. But their ears stayed tuned to every sound: the scrape of Silas's chair, the faint clink of his glass, the whisper of his coat as he leaned forward. Nobody wanted to make eye contact. Not because they feared death, but because they feared being remembered by him. Clara dared to speak. "You from far out, mister?" He looked at her, and the weight of his gaze seemed to still the air. "Far enough," he said simply, and took another sip. She nodded, sensing that was all the answer he'd give. Still, she found herself drawn to him, not out of fear, but out of some quiet recognition. There was a sadness about him, like a man carrying too many graves behind his eyes. A nervous ranch hand dropped a coin, and the clatter sounded like a gunshot. Every head turned, every muscle tensed. Silas didn't move. He just stared at the young man long enough to freeze the blood in his veins. Then he went back to his drink. The poker game resumed, slower now, quieter. Even the piano player began a hesitant tune again, though his fingers trembled over the keys. Outside, the wind shifted. The sound of distant thunder rolled across the plains, the kind that promised a hard rain, or a gunfight. Inside, Clara filled Silas's glass again without asking. He took it, eyes fixed on the window where the last light was dying behind the buttes. His reflection in the glass looked like a ghost that refused to fade. A drifter leaned toward another at a nearby table and whispered, "That's him, ain't it? The one from Silver Mesa." The other man nodded, eyes wide. "Burned down a whole camp. They say 20 men died that night. All outlaws. He left their boss hanging from a tree with a sign said, 'Justice rides alone.'" The drifter shuddered. "Lord have mercy." Clara pretended not to hear, but she did. Everyone did. Silas's hand paused over his drink. A faint flicker crossed his eyes, something between regret and remembrance. For a moment, the saloon felt smaller, tighter, like the air itself feared to move. He stood slowly, adjusted his hat, and walked to the window. The street outside was empty, the last glow of day bleeding into night. "You folks lock your doors tonight," he said quietly, voice low enough that only Clara caught it. "Storm's coming, Dot." She didn't know if he meant the weather or something worse, but she nodded anyway. He turned back to his table, poured the last of his whiskey, and sat in silence. In the flicker of lamplight, the scar on his face looked like a lightning bolt frozen in flesh. The men around him tried to forget he was there, but they couldn't. You don't forget the presence of a loaded gun, even when it doesn't move. Outside, a lone horse neighed in the dark, restless, sensing something its raider hadn't yet seen. The air thickened with the smell of rain and tension. Inside, Clara's fingers shook as she wiped the counter, though she didn't know why. She could feel the shift, the way a bird feels a hawk before it sees it. Something was coming to Red Hollow. And when it did, this quiet moment, this strange night when the outlaw everyone feared said drinking alone, would be the last calm breath the town would ever take. They said later that when Silas Kane looked at a man, he didn't just see him, he measured him. Measured the space he'd take in the ground, the time it would take for his name to be forgotten, and whether he was worth a bullet. Tonight, no one dared meet those eyes long enough to find out which they were. The night had settled heavy over Red Hollow, the kind that pressed down like a weight on the chest. Inside the saloon, the lanterns burned low, their light flickering over whiskey glasses and tired faces. The wind outside had gone still. Only the creak of the signboard and the faint hum of the piano gave the illusion that life carried on. Clara was behind the bar again, her soft voice the only sound that cut through the stale air, offering another round to the men trying to forget the day. Silas Kane sat where he had been for hours, one hand around his glass, the other resting motionless on the table. He hadn't said a word since warning about the storm, but somehow every man there felt it had already arrived. Then came the horses, 5 of them, pounding up the street like thunder across open plains. The ground trembled faintly under their hooves. A few men by the windows stiffened. One cursed under his breath. Clara's hand paused mid-polish, the rag hanging limp between her fingers. The piano stopped altogether. And then the door burst open, carrying with it a gust of dust and danger. The Bracken brothers swaggered in, spurs jangling, laughter cutting through the room like a blade. Their leader, Cole Bracken, was a broad man with a face half hidden beneath a scruff of beard and meanness in his eyes that could curdle milk. His brothers, Jeb and Roy, followed close behind, one grinning, the other dragging a whip along the floorboards just to hear the sound. Red Hollow had seen them before. Every visit ended the same way: trouble, bruises, sometimes blood. "Well, hell," Colt said, sweeping his gaze across the room. "If it ain't quieter than a preacher's grave in here." No one answered. His grin widened. "Don't get up, boys. We just came for a drink and maybe a little conversation." He slapped a silver dollar on the counter hard enough to make the bottles jump. Clara forced a smile. "Evenin', Colt. You and your brother's looking for whiskey." He leaned over the bar, close enough that she could smell the rot gut on his breath. "That And maybe a smile from you, darling. Been riding long days. A man forgets what kindness looks like. Clara tried to stay calm. You'll get your whiskey. But let's keep the peace tonight, huh? He laughed, a sound like gravel scraping metal. Peace. In Red Hollow. Don't you worry, sweetheart. We're peaceable enough, till someone gives us reason not to be. He poured the whiskey down his throat in one gulp and slammed the glass down. His eyes drifted toward the corner where Silas Kane sat, half-shadowed by lamplight. Well now, Cole muttered, squinting. Ain't seen you here before, stranger. You lost. Silas didn't move. He just swirled the amber liquid in his glass, calm as a pond before a storm. Just passing through. Jeb Bracken chuckled. Passing through, huh? You don't look like a drifter. You look like a man with something to hide. Silas's gaze lifted just enough for the lamplight to catch his eyes. Cold steel meeting the fire of fools. Best you don't dig where there ain't gold. The saloon fell quiet again. A few of the locals tried to slip out unnoticed, but Roy blocked the door with the tip of his whip, coiling it lazily around his wrist. Nah, nobody's leaving. We're just getting started. Clara's heart hammered in her chest. She stepped between the outlaws and Silas, voice trembling but firm. You boys want another round, I'll pour it. But you'll leave my customers alone. Colt smirked, tilting his head. Your customers? Ain't that sweet? A barmaid with a backbone. His eyes darkened. But I don't take kindly to being told what to do, especially by a woman who don't know when to keep quiet. He took a step closer, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Silas watched without moving, his hand still far from his gun, his expression unreadable. Clara could feel the tension coil through the room like a rattlesnake ready to strike. Jeb sneered. Ain't that right, Colt? Maybe she needs a reminder who runs things round here. Clara shook her head, backing away. You've had enough. Go home. But Colt reached across the counter, grabbed her by the wrist, and yanked her forward. The glass in her hand shattered against the edge of the bar. She gasped, the sound sharp and small. I said, Colt hissed, you don't tell me what to. The slap cracked through the room like a gunshot. Clara stumbled back, her cheek burning, her hand pressed to her face. The poker players froze mid-game, eyes wide. The piano player stood up so fast his chair toppled over. For one breathless second, the saloon existed in silence, every soul waiting for the next move. Colt grinned, drunk on cruelty. Now maybe you'll learn some. The scrape of a chair broke the air. Slow, deliberate. Every head turned. Silas Kane stood. He didn't move fast. He didn't need to. His shadow stretched long across the floor, his figure tall and ghostly under the lamplight. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried like thunder rolling in from the mountains. You shouldn't have done that. Colt laughed, uncertain. What's that, old man? Silas took one step forward. The floorboards creaked under his boots. Lay a hand on her again, and I'll make sure you never use it. Jeb spat on the floor. Big words for a stranger sitting alone in a corner. Roy uncoiled his whip with a snap. Think you can scare us, old-timer? Silas's hand remained away from his gun. His eyes, though, never left Colt's. Calm. Icy. Measured. No, he said softly. Not scare. Warn. The laughter came again, forced, nervous. Colt turned toward his brothers. You hear that? He's warning us. Maybe he thinks he's some kind of hero. He looked back at Silas, grinning wide. Tell me, gunman, you ever shot a man for fun? Silas's voice dropped lower, colder. No, but I've buried plenty who thought it was. The room seemed to shrink around them. The lantern flame flickered. Colt's grin faltered for just a breath before rage filled the space where fear should have been. He grabbed Clara again, this time dragging her out from behind the counter, her boots scraping the floor. Let's see if your friend's as tough as he sounds, he jeered. Maybe I'll teach her how to pour a drink proper. Clara screamed, the sound raw and terrified. The piano stopped. The drifter by the window crossed himself. Even the wind outside went silent. Silas didn't blink. His eyes followed every movement, the way Colt's hand tightened around Clara's arm, the quiver in her shoulders, the reflection of the outlaw's knife flashing in the bar mirror. He could feel the pulse of the room, every breath, every heartbeat, all waiting on his next move. Colt shoved Clara toward the counter, laughing, but the sound died halfway through his throat. Because Silas had moved. Not fast, not flashy, just precise. His chair lay tipped over behind him, his right hand resting on the cold peacemaker at his hip, his finger hovering over the trigger. The room filled with that strange, electric stillness that comes just before lightning strikes. "Let her go," Silas said. Colt sneered, pressing the blade lightly against Clara's throat. "Or what?" The air held its breath. Silas's gaze didn't waver. "Or you won't finish that sentence." Jeb took a step forward. "Boss." He never finished either. The gunfire came so fast, so clean, that no one remembered hearing the draw. Just the sound, one sharp crack that split the night in half. The glass behind the bar shattered. Colt staggered backward, clutching his shoulder, the knife clattering to the floor. His brothers froze, eyes wide. Clara fell to her knees, gasping, untouched but trembling. Smoke curled lazily from Silas's revolver. He didn't even look at it. Roy dropped the whip. Jeb's hand hovered over his gun, but fear pinned it there. Colt stumbled, swearing, blood seeping through his coat. You son of a..." Silas raised his gun again. "Don't," he warned. Gun smoke still hung thick in the air, curling toward the rafters like the last breath of a dying storm. Clara sat behind the counter, trembling, a thin line of blood running from her temple where a bottle had shattered. Her eyes were wide but alive, fixed on the men who stood before her. Silas Kane holstered his gun without a word. Two bodies lay sprawled on the floor, Jeb Bracken face down near the stove, Roy slumped beside the poker table, his hand still gripping a half-drawn revolver. The rest of the gang had bolted into the night, boots pounding the dirt outside, their shouts scattering into the wind. "Are you hurt?" Silas asked quietly. His voice was calm, steady, so unlike the chaos around them that it almost felt unreal. Clara shook her head, breath catching in her throat. "No. I'm fine. Just shaken." He nodded once, eyes scanning the room, the mess, the broken glass, the fear that still clung to the walls. "Stay here. Bar the doors." "Silas, where are you?" But he was already moving, pushing through the swinging doors into the night. The wind hit him full in the face, cool and sharp, carrying with it the metallic scent of gunfire. Out on the empty street, the hoofprint were fresh, cutting through the mud like a trail of guilt. The Brackens were running for the hills, men who'd killed and laughed and called it sport. Silas tightened the strap of his gun belt, then whistled low. From the stable, a black stallion answered, a creature of muscle and smoke, eyes burning with the same cold fire as its rider. "Come on, Ghostfire," Silas murmured, his voice half prayer, half command. "We've got work to do." He mounted up, boots settling in the stirrups with a familiar creak. The moon had risen high, its light spilling silver across the plains. He didn't look back toward Red Hollow. The saloon lights flickered behind him, but his eyes were fixed on the dark horizon ahead. When Ghostfire moved, it was like shadow made flesh, silent, swift, unstoppable. The town faded behind them as they tore down the valley, the wind singing through the canyons like a warning to anyone who still believed justice slept. He rode not for vengeance, but for balance. There was no fury in his movements, no madness in his heart, only a grim, steady purpose. The Brackens had brought cruelty where there should have been peace, and cruelty had a price. In another life, Silas might have prayed for their souls. But prayers, he'd learned, were wasted on men who had none. Their trail wound through the canyon, illuminated by the moon and the faint glow of torches they carried. Silas reined Ghostfire to a crawl near the ridge, listening. Voices echoed below, panicked, arguing, desperate. "Jeb's dead. Roy too. He shot 'em both. I told you we shouldn't have crossed him. Shut up and keep riding. Colt'll figure something." The crack of a rifle split the air. The rear rider toppled from his horse before the echo had faded, his body tumbling into the sand. The others spurred their mounts, shouting curses into the night. Silas chambered another round, eyes cold behind the brim of his hat. He fired again. Another fell. They called him an outlaw once, but that word had never fit. Outlaws took what wasn't theirs. Silas only ever took back what the wicked had stolen. Peace, safety, dignity. He moved through the canyon like death itself, silent and patient. Each shot he fired was measured, deliberate, righteous. The desert swallowed their screams one by one. By the time he reached the dry riverbed, only two horses galloped ahead, Colt Bracken and his youngest brother, Earl. Colt's voice carried over the wind, raw with fury. Ride, damn you. He's not human. Silas urged Ghostfire forward. The stallion leapt a fallen log, hooves striking sparks off the rock. The chase wound through twisting ravines, the moon flashing between cliffs like the blink of a god watching from above. Earl glanced back, saw Silas closing, and pulled his gun with shaking hands. He fired wild, the shots ricocheting off stone. Silas didn't flinch. He lined up his sight, waited for the right breath, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet caught Earl clean in the shoulder. He screamed, spinning off his saddle, crashing hard into the dirt. His horse bolted into the night. Silas didn't stop to finish him. Justice wasn't vengeance. The boy would live, and remember. Only Colt remained. The canyon opened into a flat stretch of scrubland, where moonlight poured like cold fire over the earth. Colt rode hard, spurring his horse until foam flecked its mane. He knew the terrain, knew there was a narrow pass ahead that led to the old ridge trail. If he could make it there, maybe he could lose the ghost chasing him. But ghosts can't be outrun. Silas leaned low over Ghostfire's neck, the wind stinging his eyes, the ground rushing by in a blur of pale dust. Each breath came slow, controlled. His mind drifted, not to the present, but to a night long ago. Flames licking up the walls of his ranch. His wife screaming. His daughter's small voice lost in the roar of fire. The smell of smoke and blood and burning wood. And through it all, the laughter of men who thought they'd destroyed him. The same laughter Colt Bracken carried in his voice tonight. He pressed his knees into Ghostfire's sides. The stallion surged forward, a black blur against the silver plain. The distance closed. Colt looked back once, and saw the men he'd thought was dead all those years ago. His face went pale as moonlight. No, Colt breathed. It can't be you. Silas drew level, his revolver raised but not fired. It's me, he said quietly. And it's time you remembered what you took. Colt's hand trembled on his reins. I didn't know. It was just orders. We thought you were dead. Silas's voice was steady, low, full of the quiet kind of anger that burns deeper than fire. You made sure of that. The horses thundered side by side, breath steaming in the cold air. Colt tried to draw his gun, but his hand shook too much. Silas fired, not at his chest, but at his horse's leg. The beast screamed, stumbled, and threw Colt hard to the ground. Dust rose around him like smoke from an old sin rekindled. Silas dismounted, boots crunching on gravel. Colt scrambled backward, hand pressed to the wound on his shoulder, face twisted in pain. Don't kill me, he rasped. I didn't mean to, back then. It wasn't me who lit the fire. Silas holstered his gun and crouched, his shadow falling over the wounded men. You were there. That's enough. I can pay you, money, gold, whatever you want. I don't want gold. His voice softened, though his eyes stayed hard. I want the world to remember that good people aren't prey. That when you raise a hand to the helpless, someone like me is watching. Colt's breathing turned ragged. You think this makes you better than us? No, Silas said, standing. It just makes me the one who still feels the weight of what's right. He turned toward Ghostfire, but Colt's voice rose behind him, desperate. Then why didn't you die with them? Why keep living just to kill? Silas paused. The wind swept through the canyon, carrying away the silence. Because someone has to stand in the ashes, he said, without turning back. Someone has to make sure the fire doesn't spread. He walked to his horse, the moon glinting off the steel of his revolver. For a moment, the desert was utterly still. Then came the sound of a gun cocking, Colt's last, trembling act of defiance. The shot cracked the night wide open, echoing off the canyon walls. But it wasn't Silas who fell. His bullet had flown faster, truer, striking Colt's pistol clean from his hand. It clattered into the dirt beside him, smoking, useless. Dawn crept slowly over Red Hollow, soft and uncertain, painting the valley in shades of bruised gold and pale blue. The dust still carried the scent of last night's rain mixed with gunpowder, a strange calm after the storm. From the east came the faint rhythm of hooves, steady and unhurried, as though time itself had slowed to listen. The townsfolk stepped from their doors, blinking against the light, and froze when they saw him. Silas Kane rode down the main street with the wounded men slumped behind him, bound to the saddle by a frayed rope. Colt Bracken's head hung low, his once proud face now gray with pain and defeat. Every eye followed them, shopkeepers, ranchers, drifters, all silent, all aware they were watching something that would be remembered long after they were gone. Ghostfire's black mane shimmered in the early light, each step stirring a small cloud of dust that glowed like ash in the sun. Silas didn't look left or right. His face was calm, unreadable, carved from the same silence that filled the canyon where the brackens had fallen. When he stopped in front of the saloon, the old sign creaked above him, the Hensley Saloon, still scarred from broken glass and bullet holes. Clara stood in the doorway, her apron stained, her eyes rimmed with red from a night without sleep. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then she stepped forward, hands trembling, the light catching in her hair like fire. He dismounted, boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. The sound echoed down the street like a closing chapter. He cut the rope from Colt's wrists, letting the men tumble into the dirt. The outlaw groaned, half-conscious, the dust clinging to the blood on his shirt. No one went near him. Silas turned instead to Clara. "It's done," he said quietly. She looked at him, really looked, and something inside her seemed to give way. Gratitude, sorrow, awe, they all mixed together until words felt too small to hold them. "You shouldn't have gone after them," she whispered. "You could have been killed." Silas shrugged, a faint, tired smile ghosting across his lips. "Maybe. But I've been running from ghosts long enough. Figured it was time to ride toward one." She stepped closer, her voice breaking. Why help me? You don't even know me." He removed his hat, eyes lowered, and for the first time, the hardness in him softened. "No one should cry in a place like this," he said. "Not while I'm breathing." Her throat tightened. The wind stirred between them, lifting strands of her hair. She wanted to speak, wanted to thank him properly, but the words never came. Instead, she reached for his hand. He hesitated, then took it gently, the warmth of her fingers grounding him to the world again. For a man who had spent years in silence, it felt like hearing music for the first time. Behind them, the sheriff finally stepped forward, his badge catching the sun. "You bring him back alive?" he asked. Silas nodded. "Alive enough to hang." The sheriff tipped his hat, uneasy. "Heard stories about you. Don't sound real." "Most stories aren't," Silas replied, slipping his hat back on. "Just make sure the truth ends here." As the sheriff and his deputies dragged Cole Bracken away, the town remained hushed, watching the stranger who had walked into their nightmares and turned them into justice. Children peered from windows, wide-eyed. Old men whispered names they hadn't spoken in years. Even the drunk by the trough crossed himself. When Silas finally turned back to his horse, Clara's hand shot out again. "Don't go," she said softly. He paused, resting a hand on Ghostfire's neck. The stallion snorted, restless, sensing its master's thoughts. "I've never been much good at staying," Silas said. "Places like this deserve peace, and peace doesn't follow men like me." "But where will you go?" He looked east, where the land stretched endless in gold beneath the waking sun. "Wherever the wind carries the smell of trouble," he murmured. "There's always another town that's forgotten what justice sounds like." Clara blinked back tears. "You don't have to keep fighting." He met her gaze, and for a fleeting second, the weight of his life showed, every scar, every loss, every night haunted by fire and memory. "Maybe not," he said. "But some men are made to fight, so others can forget how." He swung into the saddle, the leather creaking softly. The first rays of morning brushed his face, softening the scar that ran across it. For the briefest moment, he looked younger, almost at peace. He touched the brim of his hat to her. "Take care, Miss Hensley." She nodded, lips trembling. "You too, Mr. Kane." He pulled the reins, and Ghostfire began to move. The townsfolk parted silently as he passed, hats lowered, eyes downcast. No one spoke until he was almost at the end of the street. Then a boy, barely 12, called out, his voice clear and trembling. "Mister, were you really an outlaw?" Silas slowed, glancing back over his shoulder. The corner of his mouth lifted, faint but real. "Depends who's telling the story," he said, and then he was gone. He rode out through the canyon, where the wind still whispered through the sagebrush and the horizon shimmered like a mirage. Dust trailed behind him, glowing in the morning sun like smoke from a fading fire. The world swallowed him whole, as if the desert itself knew he didn't belong to it, or maybe that it belonged to him. The narrator of time would one day say, "Some men kill for revenge, others to set the world right again." Silas Kane rode not for glory, not for gold, but for the simple truth that peace must sometimes be bought with the weight of a gun. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, Red Hollow was alive again. The blacksmith reopened his forge. The preacher stepped onto his porch and said a prayer. And Clara swept the saloon floor, her mind lost somewhere between grief and gratitude. The blood had been scrubbed away, but something of him lingered, a presence, a stillness, a promise that decency could still exist even in a world that had forgotten it. Weeks passed. The sheriff hung cold bracken on the edge of town. No one came to claim his body. When the gallows were taken down, the people built something else in its place, a new sign over the saloon door. The letters were carved by hand, uneven but proud, the Cane Star. Clara painted the edges gold, so they caught the light just right at sunset. Every night, she lit a single lamp in the window, a quiet beacon for a man who might never pass this way again. Years turned like pages in an old Bible. Red Hollow grew, weathered, changed. New faces came, old ones faded into the dust. But stories have a way of outliving the men who make them. Travelers passing through would stop at the saloon for a drink and ask about the name. The old folks would lean in close, their voices dropping to a hush. "They say he rode through once," they'd whisper. "A man dressed in black, eyes like winter steel. He came when evil touched a woman's face and left the world right again." Some call him Outlaw, some call him Savior, but all agree on one thing: his wrath turned into legend. And on quiet nights, when the wind sighed across the plains and the lantern light flickered against the window glass, Clara would look out into the dark and imagine the faint echo of hoofbeats, steady, distant, eternal, carrying a ghost named Silas Kane farther and farther from the world that had made him, and deeper into the one that would never forget.